some invisible tea here. And speaking of invisible, well, slowly rising from the depths of the Japanese tea room, I'm Brittney Gallagher, and I'm joined by.
And I'm Phil Libin. Welcome to the next episode, I guess the current episode of Degrees of Freedom, Making the Out of Office World.
Yeah. Last week we were talking about trust in the out of office world and how we build that and how we trust by default. And in this episode, we're going to expand on that a little bit and maybe talk about what we did wrong in the previous world and how in the distributed world, we may actually be able to do things better. Before we get doing things better, Phil, I wanted to ask you, was there something that you did in the early days of or All Turtles when you switched to being distributed that maybe didn't work out very well?
I mean, lots of things. Yeah, lots and lots and lots of things. I think the key is just to not be attached to any particular outcome and just kind of try out a bunch of stuff until you see what works. We started, for example, getting people together once in a while, in person, and we figured, we only see each other pretty rarely, so we should really schedule it, pretty tightly. And so like our first few in-person meetings were really just like scheduled. We had, every half hour what we were doing and what we were going to talk about, and we had slides and all that stuff. And that turned out to be pretty terrible. It turned out that actually the most productive times of getting together in person were all the things that were unplanned, because like all of the structure stuff we actually got done pretty well, on video or asynchronously, and no one actually wanted to sit in a room in person and show slides to each other. So now when we schedule in-person get-togethers, it's probably 70% of the time is just sort of left open for people to go and chat and figure out what comes out of it. And that's been working much better.
You only know if you try it, right? It's science.
Exactly.
Test those hypotheses and see what works and what doesn't. Asana's Joanna Miller is here to talk about impact versus performance and how you can actually tell you're doing well in this out-of-office world.
And we'll be back with Tammy Sun at Fertility, who's going to be talking about performance reviews, fully distributed company. Carrot's up to several hundred people, most of them new since the pandemic. And so most of them having never met each other, or at least not until after they started working together, and very high performing team. I am eager to know how Tammy does that.
And later in the episode, I'm joined by Adriana Fracchia-Leigh to talk about some of the challenges she's faced personally working distributedly. But first, here's Phil and I in person talking about some of the challenges and ultimately the opportunities this out-of-office world is presenting. What challenges are you maybe not prepared for that you haven't foreseen, like with this transformation?
Yeah, I think a lot of things are hard, fully distributed, but a lot of things are hard. A lot of things were hard before. Stuff's just hard. I think that things make a lot more sense and started making a lot more sense for us once we stopped thinking about this as a short-term thing, that we were just going to wait out and go back to the way things were. As soon as we let go of that illusion that we're not going back to the way things were, and actually the way things were kind of sucked. So we don't want to go back. We want to go forward to the way things should be and sort of designing our lives that way. Things started making a lot more sense. They were still hard, but at least we had the motivation for why we were doing this. And it wasn't a short-term thing. It wasn't like, let's wait it out. It was, let's put in the work to figure it out. Exactly. To build what we want our new reality to be. And that new reality should be better than the old reality, not almost as good, not a poor substitute, better. So yeah, so a lot of stuff's hard. And it's what you expect. Communication is harder, performance evaluations are harder, mentorship is harder. A lot of the stuff that you would expect to be harder is harder. But we have to ask, well, it's harder than the old ways we were doing it, but the old ways we were doing it weren't very good, and maybe they were just easy because we were used to them. And because we allowed ourselves to do the things that we were used to, even if they weren't very good, we're actually excluding a lot of people, and it was very suboptimal. So now there's difficulty because we have to reinvent it, but it's also an opportunity to reinvent it in a way to actually be better and more exclusive. Like, for example, performance management. And we were like, well, how do you do performance management when you're fully distributed? How do you even evaluate what people are doing? I'm like, well, how do we do it? How do we do it before? And it turned out that before we a lot of times, yeah, had some formal processes, but a lot of it was pretty informal. A lot of my evaluation of your performance before was did you look busy?
When I walked by your desk, were you on
Yeah.
Facebook?
Yeah. Were you in the office when I showed up in the morning? Were you still there when I left? Did you look like you were working hard? Yeah, okay. Brittney seems productive, right? That wasn't a good way to evaluate productivity.
Yeah.
And very few people would admit that that's what we did, but that's what we did. And now you can't because I don't see you in the office. And so I can't be well, does she look busy? Good riddance, right? That was a crutch. That was a shortcut that never worked particularly well. And for people who, for perfectly justifiable reasons, couldn't be in the office, when I walked in the morning or left, they would be penalized for that, even if if it was unintentional.
It was subjective.
Or not everyone is good at looking busy. In fact, looking busy is not a particularly relevant skill.
It's not really useful,
right? Why are we optimizing for that? And the same thing for but isn't it harder to hire people if you don't meet them in person? How do you know if you can trust someone? Well, bullshit. Why is being good on an in-person interview? Why are we optimizing for that skill? Is being impressive in person really what I'm hiring people for? One of the things we do now is we don't negotiate salaries anymore, just because we have pay scales and those matters. We don't negotiate. Why did we before? Why are we rewarding negotiating skills? Unless I'm hiring you to be a negotiator, in which case, go ahead and negotiate your salary. If I'm hiring you to be an engineer,
right? Should all engineers make the same amount of money?
No, they should make the same amount of money based on their contribution and their level.
Yeah.
Not every single person makes the same amount of money, but
right.
Engineer level 4 should make the same amount of money as any other engineer level 4 or whatever.
Right, but that's just certainly not true, right? In other companies, if you're
be.
not good at negotiating, you're going to get paid less because they can pay you less.
But why should the company reward your negotiating skill when they're not hiring you for your negotiating skill?
I completely agree with you. Right. I'm just saying that I think this is why we have a lot of inequality in how people are paid.
But all of this was what we built in the old world, and now this is an opportunity to say, well, that doesn't work anymore, and it can't work because we can't rely on those shortcuts. So, we have to rebuild it, and the rebuilding is difficult because it's nice. It's easier for management to set salaries based on how hard you negotiate, and it's harder to not do that. But it's better to not do that. And so so everything is hard, but it's an opportunity to make it worthwhile. And I think we've done, we've had mixed success so far, but we try a bunch of different things, and the ones that work we double down on, and the ones that don't work we pretend we never did.
That was Phil and I during some of that valuable in-person time, discussing the challenges this distributed world has created, and how maybe those challenges can become opportunities. Up next, Phil interviews Joanna Miller and Tammy Sun to talk about some of those challenges and how we can tell we're doing well as both companies and individuals in this out-of-office world.
Back when we were all in the central office, there was a lot of theatricality. There was a lot of theatrical performance and how your work performance was measured. A lot of it did have to do with, well, do you look busy?
Yes.
Do you look like you have a good attitude? Are you there in the office before I get in there, and you're still there when I leave? And now that we're distributed, I have no idea. I don't know if you look busy or not. I don't know how many hours you work. So the performative aspect is kind of gone. I need ways to evaluate your impact. Maybe performance isn't the right word. Maybe it should be impact.
Yeah.
Your impact without resorting to these performative things that we all used to use as crutches before.
Exactly. And it's actually funny that you chose the word impact, because that's what we named our feedback cycle. We called it growth and impact. The reason we're even collecting feedback for folks is so that they can grow in whatever domains that they would like to, and that they can increase their impact towards our shared goals as a company.
I think we're lucky in that we have a strong sort of set of DNA around high performance. And as a manager, for those who are managers or leaders in leadership positions, or even frankly individual contributors, which I wish I could be, you want to create a performance management and performance culture that makes your best people want to continue to work there because they are surrounded by other great people. I think it's a simple idea. It's the hardest thing to implement, because what that means is that you constantly have to keep not the highest band high, you have to keep the average high. And so performance management is as much about like the company's recruiting process and how good we are at identifying who is going to be a right fit in this company. Because if somebody doesn't perform and they leave the company, that's as much my fault and our fault as it is the person's fault, right?
And more importantly, it's more your fault in the way
right.
in the way that counts, which is they're not there anymore, so it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
You're still around, so you should have learned from it.
Right, exactly. So I think like we have as I said, we're lucky to have a very strong performance culture, but we also have a very strong like network and alumni and like no hard feelings culture. We want, and I've said this many times, like we want a very wide and expansive network of Carrot alumni who continue to feel good about the contributions that they made at Carrot, and continue to feel like they're rooting for us, because we're rooting for them.
Yeah. And alumni is a really interesting way to think about that. And I've thought about that quite a bit. Universities have alumni, and you're, because obviously you're not expected to be at a university for life. You're expected to be there for 4 years or whatever. And then you're alumni, and you root for them, and you root for the sports ball team, and you still have an affinity. And somehow with companies, even though I think the average tenure of a knowledge worker in a modern company is actually less than 4 years. I think like people spend less time in companies than they do at their university. But then when you leave, it's like a bad thing. You're not thought of as an alumni. So maybe maybe the business world learned work with people online before you meet them in person for dating apps, and maybe we learned treating former employees as alumni from universities. Maybe there's like a whole bunch of models that we can adopt.
Yeah, I think as I said, like we continue to root for folks when they leave Carrot and they go on to do other things, and we think that they're rooting for us.
So in a, let's say you're in a distributed team, and when we were all in the central office, like we all kind of knew a little bit, how to do this. If you want the manager to think that you're high performance, you show up on time, there's all this advice, right, about like always show up a little bit early for the meeting, and dress for the job you want, not for the job you have. And there's all of these just things that we all picked up over the past decades of general good advice. Some of these things don't work at all distributed. Some of those things work, but they have to be different. Have you developed like a set of best practices? Like, how do you advise people to actually keep that trust and do well and be seen as a high impact person when they may not be seeing people in person at all?
Yeah, the in-person touch points and signaling has decreased, but I think the encouragement around when and how to communicate over a plethora of channels that are available has increased. So one of the things I often tell people is keep your video on. Like that's a way for us to create a sense of there is a human being there, especially for a meeting. If it's more asynchronous or we're all, working on our own things, using tools like Slack, I think, are a great way for people to keep in touch on the informal and formal things. Another thing that we've talked about a lot is being thoughtful about the times in which people are collaborating together synchronously. So if we're going to be on a Zoom meeting together, like really using the benefits of that time well. So we have people all gathered here. We probably shouldn't be presenting slides during that time. That's time for us to be engaging, interacting, speaking, connecting, synthesizing things, not just ingesting information. So I think another best practice is being thoughtful about the medium you're using and for what, and if you're really maximizing the benefits of that medium.
How do you tell if you're doing well in a distributed workforce?
I think the first thing is asking for feedback. I think one signal that's overlooked about doing well is how often are you soliciting direct feedback? We often wait for it to reach us, but I think it's rare for people to go out and seek it. Another thing that I think is interesting, and this is an interesting indicator of how well you're doing, is how often people are coming to you for questions, support, or maybe even your expertise. And it's easier to hide and maybe fall into the background when you're in a distributed workforce. If people are not reaching out, that might be a signal to you that like, oh, people may not know what I'm doing or that I'm here. I think the most straightforward way that we measure this in Asana is we capture everything in tasks and projects. And so if you see a bunch of red on our milestones or tasks, that means that it's an indicator that something is off track here. We need to regroup and see maybe if the goals have changed, maybe what we need has changed, or maybe someone needs actual help with producing the thing that they're in charge of.
So what we're seeing, right, is like we're kind of changing the units of measure for a lot of these basic concepts of of trust, of what a project is, of like seeking feedback. And I think this like out of office distributed style is just accelerated. These are trends that have been around for a while, but it's really just accelerated because so much of we don't have the crutches that we used to when we were all in the office and we could see if someone looked like they were struggling, for example.
Yes.
So we have to like more intentionally do things that maybe before were just kind of on autopilot. They were never good on autopilot. We should have always been doing them intentionally, but we could get away with it on autopilot. Now we can't.
Yeah. And I agree with that. I feel like this has illuminated the ways in which poor communication habits, lack of confidence communicating, especially in stressful situations, like those skills don't change depending on the venue you're in. The impact or the magnitude of them might. And I think we're seeing that as we become more distributed as a culture. And it puts even more emphasis on the need for people to feel pretty confident and dexterous in building relationships and also communicating clearly.
Being a distributed worker isn't necessarily for everyone. Some people really do prefer more frequent in-person touch points with their colleagues. I'm joined by Adriana Fracchia-Leigh, a design strategy and operations lead, to talk about some of the challenges she faced working in an out-of-office world. In this episode, we're talking about challenges there are working remotely, and some of them turn into opportunities. But Adriana, I want to know for you, what was it like working remotely, and what did you find difficult about it?
Sure. So, I mean, I think in the first few months of working remotely, back in March, April, May of 2020, it was exciting. I was like, oh, I get to be at home and do what I want to do and take care of my dogs. And it was not kind of novel because I had always gone to an office. But quickly, when I realized that whole thing was going to be longer than 3 months and wasn't going to just be sort of a blip, I quickly realized how much I missed being in the office and being around people, and not just being in the office, but just having the option of being in an office. And it actually really affected my mental health. And I started to get pretty depressed. I'm pretty open about that.
Was there something specific that you can link back to that you felt made it hard? Like, just was it the lack of seeing people in real life or in the physical world?
Yeah.
Do you know what it was?
I think it's the in between meeting conversations that happen, the being around people during lunch, the talking to people who you don't necessarily like work with, but they're part of your company, to understand what's going on in other parts of the organization. So it was like those micro conversations that I think really made a big difference, like walking up the stairs with someone or being in an elevator or just passing by, where you just can't replicate that online. And in my opinion, I think I've tried a lot of things like, Zoom happy hour or Zoom, coffee morning or something. And you're still forcing someone into a box, right? Into a certain amount of time. And so I think it was the subtle things.
So do you find that the real life interactions are less draining than the virtual ones?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that I think there is something that I feel is very performative when I'm like, when there's a camera, right? There's just like physically having a camera in the room I think changes things and changes how you react, or how I react, or how I act in a scenario. So being in person or not in person, to me, there's choice that comes in it, in this equation. And I think the conversation that we're having a lot of the time is about, should we go back or should we not? Is it better to be in person? Is it not better to be in person? And I'm like, that's not the right conversation. To me, I think it's, let's give people choice.
I think there's definitely, a push-pull in any situation. And I think a lot of what is trying to do is to not say we should be fully remote all the time. There's just, we're in person less, and we're in person for these valuable sorts of conversations, which is maybe less than the bumping into each other in the hall and having conversation, but for these high touch points types of things.
Right. Which I mean, I don't want to, I'm a little bit of an argumentative person, but let's just say it's more being a devil's advocate. But to me, because I get that, I think a lot of companies are doing that. They're fully remote, and then they're like, let's come together 3 times a year or 4 times a year and make it really intentional. And to me, it's the intentionality that actually doesn't really work. And it's like I said, it's like we're going to box ourselves into this period of time where now we have to be together. But it's all those little like in between moments that, you can't put into a box. You can't put it on a calendar. You can't, attach a Zoom meeting or an space to it that builds connection, right? And I think that the connection between people in the workplace is really important to build good products.
One of the things I'm kind of learning throughout and I'm doing these interviews and over the course of the series is like, there really isn't necessarily a one size fits all. Like everyone has a different preference. So if you like working mostly remote and that's works for you, then you should gravitate, to those types of companies. But if you're someone who wants that more in-person hybrid thing, then you should gravitate towards that. It's just, I think what's really gone, or what is really a lot of people are struggling with, is that full time in the office again. Like 5 days, like no one wants to do it.
No, I don't want to do it. I don't want to commute. I mean, my office is in the city. I live in the East Bay, so it's a hour door to door each way. I think it comes down to choice, choice and flexibility. And I think that humans should have the choice and the flexibility, and that the companies that are requiring people to come back full time, even if people like me like to be in person, the requirement becomes then a barrier to wanting to show up and, doing your best at work, because then your choice gets taken away.
Yeah. A lot of what I'm learning in this series is like freedom and allowing for more freedom and choice, like you said. And I think that that's like a really, really great way of framing it. Well, thank you so much, Adriana, for joining us. This has been really insightful. And I think, a slightly different take on what we've talked about a lot in this series, but I still think a really valuable one. And I think a lot of people identify with, what you're saying and what you're feeling. So thank you again.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, I appreciate the conversation. I think that these are really, really valid questions to be talking about and discussing.
One thing Adriana mentioned after the interview that I think was interesting, and it's not, this is not necessarily a one size fits all. And what happens when the same type of people gravitate towards working distributedly? You have people who really like working remote, all working at a remote company and then building products together. But all of those people, are kind of have the same type of, maybe not background, but they have, in some sense, they're all very much the same person. And can you still build something excellent when you maybe have less of a type of variety?
Well, I think there is a lot of self-selection, self-filtering that's already happening. That's going to happen. So people who want to be distributed are going to be attracted to companies who are run that way and who offer that, and people who want to go back, be in an office, are going to be attracted to companies who do that. Hypothetically, I actually think when you really get down to it, and people have enough experience with both realities, and they're not making a theoretical choice. They're not making sort of a, grass is always greener on the other side choice. They're actually making an informed choice. I think there's very few people that are going to say, for example, I would like to spend 3 hours a day in traffic. I actively want that, which is really going to constrain the kinds of companies that are back in the office to companies that are maybe located in places where it's not crazy traffic and have other kind of quality of life issues. So, here I am in Bentonville, Arkansas, and there's a lot of Walmart people, and they're in the office, but a lot of them live around here, and it isn't multiple hours of a commute. So in general, I think that's great. I think it's good for people to have as many options as possible and to make the choices. And like with every other area of life, you'll get people gravitating towards clustering around the choices that they make.
Most people who work from laptops don't want to be back in the office full time. I mean, it's pretty clear. Even the people who I've talked to who are excited about going to the office don't want to go every day. And this week, or recently, Elon announced that SpaceX and Tesla employees must be back in the office a minimum of 40 hours a week, or he considers them not showing up their resignation. Phil, it's a lot of people work at SpaceX and Tesla kind of driven for the mission. They're like very, like we make less, we work harder because we're so focused on this mission. But I wonder at what point mission doesn't matter. Like this seems like pretty rough, right? Like for people who work there.
Well, I mean, I don't think it's really up to me to tell Elon how to make electric cars or rockets. I mean, he's figured that out pretty well. And I can kind of see the point in this for some companies. So with Tesla, for example, right? If most of their employees, most of the people who work at Tesla, just by number, right, they're doing some physical work, right? They're probably in the factories or doing some manufacturing. And if your company is a company where most of the people are doing manufacturing, like, do you want to have a company where 60% of the people have to be at a place because they're on the assembly line, and the fancier white collar people get to be on laptops? Maybe, but maybe not. And I think it's like legit for a company to say, no, the culture that we want to make is we're all here. That's going to come with great difficulty. Obviously, a bunch of people are going to resign, and a lot of them are just people who, don't want to make that kind of a compromise, don't want to make that kind of sacrifice, whether they're mission driven or not. But the company can be clear and say, this is what we want. And I think for companies like Tesla, it kind of makes sense. Like if I was in that position, I don't know what I would do, right? Because on the one hand, I'm obviously a huge proponent to saying, if you don't need to commute, don't commute. On the other hand, if most of the company has to because they're manufacturing something physical in a physical place, I kind of like the esprit de corps of saying we're all in this together. So I don't know how I would do it. That's a decision that's above my pay grade.
Yeah, exactly. I have a similar thought myself. It's just he's moved a lot of his companies too to locations where I don't know that a lot of people are going to want to live, like in specific parts of Texas, for example. With building the Starship for SpaceX. So I think he's not, enforcing people to then be there full time, I think I think he might have some challenges there because I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's obviously going to be challenges, but I think you'd say, if you're building a mission to Mars and you're serious about it, there's going to be challenges. There's going to be things that are hard. And, is getting people to, move to Texas going to be the hardest part of that? Probably. Or maybe not. Maybe it's just one of many. But if that's the culture they want to make, that's the culture they want to make. And I admire the mission. I also think that it's kind of cool to be making electric cars and rockets and going to Mars. And I think Elon's done that, much better than I would have. So if he wants to tell people to be in the office, knowing that he's going to lose a lot of people, he's obviously betting on the fact that he can replace them. And great. It is kind of interesting to think about where can companies who require everyone to be in the office, where should they be located? Right? Because, for example, like if you're going to do that in Manhattan or in San Francisco, that's probably terrible, right? Because A, most of those people aren't actually doing physical labor anyway, and B, the commute times are going to be astronomical.
Mm-hmm. In this series, we'll continue to explore how the redistribution of opportunity is changing the world.
Thanks to our guests, to Joanna, Tammy, and Adriana for joining us today.
And that's it for this episode of Degrees of Freedom, Making the Out of Office World. I'm Brittney Gallagher.
And I'm Phil Libin. See you soon.